So, mortal, you have come here, have you? Do you not fear death? Do you not know that death itself stalks this lair? Perhaps you felt safe up till now, but I assure you, with every fiber of the being which is death itself. Oh yes, the safety has been removed, and any shelter that the master of this lair thought to bring to you has been dispelled. Now, you know that death stalks the flagstones, the corridors, rooms, and hoards of the Lair of OmnusI. Yes, indeed.
Greetings, heroes, and welcome to level 5 of my lair. You've done well to progress this far. We've covered many of the basics. There's still much yet to be learned, but for tonight, it's a special night, and let us treat it as such. Tonight, we are very close to All Hallows Eve, a special night for many gamers. Embracing this particular season, it is customary in some gaming tables to have a special theme for the game closest to Halloween or All Hallows Eve. That is to run something that moves along towards the theme of horror. Now, to the uninitiated, a horror game is one of the most difficult to pull off successfully, which is why I, OmnusI, master of the lair, comes before you this evening to offer you some advice, to offer you some bits of experiences I've had in the realm of horror. So, keep your blade sharp, your dice limber, and let us prepare to delve into the vaults of horror. As we will often do here at the lair, we will use any inspirations that we can to come up with a richer experience. In this case, in horror, it is a realm that has been mined repeatedly and often, both successfully and not so successfully, in things such as literature, as well as the many movies that have come out to delve into horror. If you have not played in a game that specializes in horror, be it the psychological and eldritch horror of Call of Cthulhu perhaps, or other games of your own devising, And there are several. I would say that using the inspirations that you may have seen from other avenues is probably going to be your best guide to what works in horror and what does not. While studying what works and what doesn't work in horror, it's important to remember a few basic rules, and we'll be covering these one at a time, so pay attention. Rule number 1. The players must feel a sense of attachment into the game. If you're running a one-shot adventure, this can be rather difficult, because you have to build up some sort of sympathy with some element in the game for the players. If you make the player characters the subject of the threat, oftentimes you have a quick inroad into the minds of the players, because as they've built up these characters, they may have extra attachment to them. Not as easy to do in a one-shot, but if you're doing a recurring campaign and decide to spring a horror episode in, that can be very effective, directly threatening the characters with some horrible fate. Now, if you don't use the player characters, it's important to have something that the players value that is threatened. You can introduce a sympathetic NPC. Oftentimes, women and children may invoke the sense of wanting to protect the vulnerable, the innocent. And these can be made as a potential target for whatever menace the feeling of horror is designed to invoke. Also, places that have significant impact or importance to the character may be infested with some sort of evil that the players feel a stake in having to root out and confront. Without those elements, your horror scenario may just fall adrift with the players not caring about what threat you're laying out. Number 2, Menace. It is important in a horror game to have some sort of risks. You can make the risk apparent, or you can be as subtle as you dare be for your players. However, the least subtle would probably be the psycho slasher killer slash monster, something that recurringly shows up for the players and is an immediate threat to either kill them or whatever they're trying to protect. Therefore, that type of menace is very easy to relate to the characters, and this thusly carry some impact of the horror to the players. And in that, it's up to the discretion of the storyteller, game master, what have you. But it is important to make it a menace that will last throughout the entire scenario. If you have the horrible monster that is one-shotted in the opening scenario, you perhaps didn't plan it out as well as you thought. Or perhaps it's time to bring in the monster's twin brother to finish his nefarious works. All in all, the menace has to have the mileage to carry through the entire scenario. Now, you don't have to go with something like a hideous monster. Perhaps the threat is of some sort of a horde. See things like The Walking Dead, Birds. There's any number of horror tropes where the sum and finality of a huge mass of foes is a greater threat than any one of them individually. This can be played off somewhat for laughs, like Arachnophobia, if you've ever seen that movie. However, it's against those kind of foes, an inexorable flood that is omnipresent can make a very effective menace. Sometimes, if you're particularly clever, you can make the characters themselves the menace. If you've ever read a work by Agatha Christie, for instance, some of her psychological mysteries work that way. There's any number of examples throughout literature, and a clever game master can figure out some sort of avenue perhaps the players weren't expecting, And that brings us to rule number 3. Rule number 3, don't give away the entire storyline in the get-go. Every good horror story begins somewhere, puts the players in a sense of some either comfort or familiarity, and then ratchets up the strangeness or ratchets up the menace, depending on what type of horror story you want to do. It should generally start out with the players puzzling things through as they go. If it is a, say, classic monster story, then perhaps the players can learn the weaknesses of the monster to give them a fighting chance against it. If it is something of lifting a curse, that curse should entail a backstory of what made the curse and what the characters have to do to resolve it. If you are going with a Hoard type scenario, for example, a zombie apocalypse story, something where there is no quick and easy solution, then sometimes a victory that can be gained can be something relatively small, but it gives the player something to work to. It should begin somewhere and then progress upwards, getting more and more tense as the players unravel more and more of the mystery or of the world around them that reveals how they have a chance to escape or how they have a chance to succeed and triumph. Which brings us to rule number 4. Never rule out hope. Even if the players are trapped and the monster is closing in, their characters may, play out that they are getting hopeless or do errant and irresponsible things, and that can certainly be in character. But rarely should you let the players themselves feel like they never had a chance. Generally, that moves on from horror because the players become numb with the thought that no matter what, they're doomed, or whatever they're trying to protect is doomed. And that's not horror. That's just finality. It becomes more like a snuff film. To maintain a sense of horror, one has to feel like things are being lost unless the tragedy that they don't succeed at what they're doing. So maintaining some semblance of hope is important in a well-run horror game. Rule number 5, pacing. Pacing is more important in a horror game than any other genre, because so much of it is crucial to build horror on horror on horror, with occasional lapses, perhaps an anticlimax, to change the tone, to brace the players so that they're ready for the next jump in horror that you're going to spring out. Too many anticlimaxes ruins the pacing. But, again, working towards a steady progression is important. And the climax, the payoff for the whole thing, of course, should be the pinnacle of the evening. Now, you may have a false climax, of course, where the players think that they've succeeded, but it's suddenly revealed that they've only scratched the surface. Perhaps they've defeated the big bad evil guys number 2 rather than the actual villain itself. Any number of ways that you can play around with the pacing, but it's a good idea from the get-go to plan out the pacing of the story. And while you're doing that, rule number 6, show, don't tell. Many movies are absolutely killed by having far too much dialogue. And if you explain the entire backstory because one person is telling them the whole thing, it sounds very much like a dry narration which breaks up your pacing and the feel of the whole thing. That's why it's so effective in some horror games that the players piece together things through scribbled notes or perhaps pieces of a journal that they find as they go. That is much better and more effective at building horror as a horrible tapestry of the story unfolds before them, rather than just having one person tell everything at once. If you show them as things go and let the players puzzle things out, that will build your suspense and your horror far better than just giving all the information out immediately. But the flip side of that is also a premise of hinting rather than showing. If you go right to, for instance, say a gore-spattered corpse, then you've already played out part of your hand. You know, or at least the players now know, that something is out to kill people. Possibly they can learn some crucial information about the creature or monster or killer right away, instead of perhaps leaving several hints that people are in jeopardy, a near fall accident rather than something that kills somebody right off the bat, can build that suspense. The moment the first body is found, immediately there's this catharsis as people suddenly know that's the gear that we're in. If you build to it with hints that horrible things are happening, you can find that the impact when you finally do spring the horror event will have a lot greater impact. Rule number 7. Remove the player's comfort zones. And how I would describe this is, for instance, a mage who is spoiled by his fireball and its ability to wipe out hordes of enemies at once, as long as he feels that his fireball can take out any threat, will have a certain level of comfort through the game. He feels it's playing on easy mode because his fireball takes out all foes. Well, if you disabuse that mage of that idea that his fireball will take care of everything, if, for instance, the monster laughs off his fireball with no or little effect, that mage may have a different output or outlook on the way that the entire thing is going to play out if he tries to rely on the same old techniques. I'm not saying grudge work and taking away everything the players can do is necessarily the best course, but it is important to try to make characters a little bit uncomfortable or very uncomfortable about the situation they find themselves in. In another aspect, it can also be useful to make the players themselves somewhat uncomfortable, and I'm not recommending anything too terrible. However, one of the most effective horror stories I've ever heard of was of a person who invited his players over for a adventure that their characters were going to take playing fairly normal people, and he gave each of his players a gas mask to simulate being in a space or low atmosphere environment. He turned the heat up in the house to make it uncomfortable and had them play out in those circumstances, which ratcheted up the tension and made them more susceptible to the horror effects. In addition, he also played strange music that he custom selected and had the entire encounter scripted out on how much more things were going to get crazier and crazier and crazier. This can work in a variety of ways. However, some of your players may take umbrage with having certain levels of their comfort taken away, so use your own judgment, but I would go sparingly about the players. Definitely make the characters uncomfortable, though. It works best for horror. Rule 8. Challenge the player's expectations. In horror, it is especially important that when players start making these expectations based on what's worked for them in the past, things oftentimes don't go right, and sometimes they can find themselves facing a very real dilemma when they've tried to make certain assumptions. This is where replacing a party member with a evil doppelganger, or perhaps involving some PC switch where an evil identical twin or some such happens. It also may mean throwing in a surprise trap where the players have no reason to expect there to be one. Make it a reasonable thing. Don't just pull things out of midair. That doesn't challenge the players, that just punishes them. But the impact of that, if they rely on what they think is true, suddenly turns out to not be true, it can leave them in a very vulnerable position, which may ratchet up the horror. And this can be a very effective tool when running a horror-type game. If this happens repeatedly, the players may start to go to ridiculous extremes to try to protect themselves against misdirection. Challenging each other with agreed-upon passwords or other challenges can be ingenious ways of trying to defeat that particular mind twist. A clever GM can find other ways, however, to do just that. Rule number 9. And now this one I'm going to hear about, I have a feeling. Rule 9, split the group. Nothing makes the players feel like they are at their strongest when they're together. However, there's any number of tricks and tools that game masters have used over the years to separate player characters to make them feel more vulnerable. Of course, the old standby, a sliding door trap that suddenly sections off parts of the game space so that the player characters can't physically get within contact with each other, can be effective. But another way is also to make sure that the party can't accomplish all of their goals if they stick together in one blob. For instance, if somebody needs protecting, but the group needs to go out and look for, say, wolfsbane to help fight off the hideous werewolf that is looking to nom on his ancestor or descendant, then the players will have to split their resources. Some to go out and get the weapon that they need to fight the werewolf, and some to protect the target of the werewolf's aggression in order to accomplish both ends. If they all left to go get the wolfsbane, they'd come back to a very mauled corpse. If they all protected the girl, they wouldn't have the weapon they need to fight off the werewolf. Those kind of things can be very effective to allow the party some decision-making on their own. Who do they send? Who do they keep? But it thins them out and keeps them feeling more vulnerable. Horror is one of the few genres where splitting the group is really encouraged, because the extra work that it takes for you to run a game is worth the payoff in the extra stress, the extra tension that they will feel when they no longer have the comfort of their entire party around them. And then finally, my rule, after everything else that I've said, rule number 10 trumps most of them, and that is restrain yourself. Now let me explain. Restraining yourself does not mean, go light on these things. Sometimes you really need to drive points home, or you really need to set up a situation to drive out any real horror into the scenario. However, if, for instance, you throw more than 2, maybe 3 jump scares at the group, something horrible that causes them to recoil in shock but doesn't really have any great immediate threat, you've probably gone too far. Your party will then start to expect jump scares, and yeah, you can change it up with an actual challenge that appears to be a jump scare. But when you use that first one, it's going to have the most impact. When you go to a second one, the impact drastically drops. And if you continue, then it becomes a running gag. Now, if you're going with kind of something a little bit more humorous, you can have a repeated running gag, and that's fine, but that's not what we're discussing here. Likewise, gore and shock. I think almost any horror movie fanatic would be able to tell you that it's easy to get jaded by too much gore. Eventually, you just feel like, okay, it's another body that's been completely exsanguinated with its entrails strewn all over the place. Okay, well, we've seen 8 or 9 other ones already. This one isn't any different. If you instead limit your expressions for, punch and impact to a few scenarios, perhaps spread out judiciously, you're going to find the effect magnified rather than drowning your players in gore or something else. Likewise, changing up the particular threat. If you are, the party is surrounded by zombies in the zombie apocalypse again, isn't it that much more significant when you find out that the zombies, while they are horrible and a threat, aren't nearly as dangerous as the other humans that you're with? And I think that's a common trend in much of the zombie lore, that that's the truth, is that the survivors are more dangerous than the zombies themselves. That has to be the case, because if it was just zombies as the only threat, it would be rather dull and play out very quickly. I'm not saying that creative storytelling couldn't sustain it for long, but you need more conflict other than the omnipresent threat of zombies around you or ghosts around you. You need some other thing rather than just relying and just driving home one thing. So a little restraint goes a long way in telling a good horror story. If you follow those 10 rules, that will give you a leg up on just telling a story, trying to scare your players and bludgeoning them down with the cool monster that you cooked up that should be able to crush them. Putting those points into place in your horror story hopefully will let you tell a more impactful, tense, and all in all, better horror story when you take your turn. Now, a couple other things that I could recommend. In horror, more than almost any other genre, atmosphere becomes extremely important. You can get by with a variety of settings. There's no universal. However, when I play, you may have noticed earlier on I had a bit of fog going. I have a fog machine, and I use it sparingly in my game. That generally tends, again, to, if the players can't see around them as easily, it ratchets up the suspense. If I take away the overhead light, and I give everybody a small, say, an LED candle to read their character sheets by, again, ratchets up the tension. If I have spooky music, like, say, a good soundtrack that any number of fun ones out there. I like Mannheim Steamroller. They had some great Halloween soundtracks. I also like my tabletop audio on tabletopaudio.com. Still recommend them. They have some very good atmospheric soundtracks that you can use and loop through your game to maintain suspense. Or remember, changing it up may help ratchet up your suspense too. Giving the player audio clues that something has changed or that they're in even more peril can be very effective. So changing the gaming space in some way, moving the players out from what is familiar, can be extremely effective. Props are also a wonderful thing to use if it involves something like masks or makeup or costuming. If there was any scenario that would be ideal for, a good horror story would be it. The good news is, around the Halloween time, there are shops full of all kinds of things that you can use to make your game have a little bit more punch. You don't have to go all out. Sometimes it could take just a few things here and there. But drawing on those experiences and making some of your own can allow you to run a successful horror game and keep your players invested enough that they will feel the impact of the horror story that you're trying to portray. So, with any luck and a bit of skill, practice, experience, and knowing your players, you can successfully entrance, enthrall, possibly shock them. But all in all, I hope that you manage to entertain them when you delve into the realms of horror. Welcome to the Treasure Hoard of Level 5. Today I thought I'd tell you about something that may, when you think about it, sound fairly obvious. However, We talk about certain things, and the assumption is that a person who is deeply and well invested in the hobby looks for various ways of constantly improving their craft and the experience of the game. I'm no exception, but I'm also not made out of money. So therefore, I've come up with a number of workarounds and useful little props that assist me in telling my stories. And I will give you one of my most basic tips. Now, I have, if you've looked at any prior episodes of the game or you watched the intro, you'll notice that I do have a certain investment in miniatures for my role-playing games. I enjoy using them, they're a great visual aid for my players, and they help the tactical sense of a game progress as you go. Now, that being said, if you decide that you are going to go and use miniatures extensively, they get rather expensive. You could spend quite a bit on getting large or rare miniatures, or getting enough to accomplish a relatively simple scenario, like finding 12 orcs to have them all pan out for a particular encounter. Now, that is one of the things that if you have a large budget and you really want a lot of reality spread out in front of the players, you could spend that kind of money. However, a frugal person will probably look for something that works but isn't quite as expensive. Now, in many role-playing games, one of the challenges that a group may end up having to face are creatures. Not necessarily monsters, but sometimes just common creatures. In this case, for instance, I'm perfectly fine admitting that I raid the toy aisle whenever I go to a store to see if they have anything that I could possibly use in my games. For instance, giant frogs, Menace in some areas. I found a bag full of plastic frogs, which are size-wise appropriate for a giant frog in many fantasy role-playing games, for under $1 for a dozen. Wolves. These are pretty much to scale for timber wolves in 28 millimeter, the classic size for Dungeons and Dragons and such. Again, found them in a tube of woodland creature miniatures and meant for children, but they work just fine in my game. I didn't spend a great deal on them, and there they go. Bugs. Insects are alien enough that they certainly make a good enemy to catch the imagination. Again, found them in a box for relatively little. And it goes on and on. Spiders, scorpions, those are pretty popular around the Halloween time. And also you can sometimes find them as novelties. Other woodland creatures. Sometimes you can find things like farm animals. If you're going to build a scenario that is set on a farm, perhaps you might want to have a choice pig miniature in case you're, say, hired to protect the pig against the encroaching kobolds or some scenario. Having a pig miniature can be nice to have, and if you find it in one of those sets, it may not cost you very much. I have in the past also gathered up several of these Micro Machines Star Wars figurines back in the day. And even though they aren't as the full-size 28mm scale, I've used these characters in Star Wars role-playing games as well. Back in the day, I bought several sets. I've got Rebels, I've got Imperials, Neutrals, I have vehicles. And again, if you go and you buy the actual figures that are available currently, it's going to set you back quite a bit. However, if you happen to have these toys lying around and you want to tell a story and use these figures, they can certainly be an attractive option to save you some money. So, that's my advice, and that is the treasure of level 5. Perhaps not as heart-stopping as the idea of horror, but I'll tell you this. If you're looking to make spooky scenery and use the element of visual design to amplify your horror game, you don't have to look very much further than your average retail store's Halloween area to find some sort of, well, let's just say that for every Christmas village, there's some elements of some horror village commonly made that you can find if you look hard enough. I do have sets of zombies and skeletons and mummies and things that I've raided from resin Halloween figurines. Detail isn't always good. Sometimes you have to go back and repaint a few things, but it can be another option if you're just starting out and don't have a lot of money. So, that's my advice and the treasure that I offer here at this level of the dungeon. You have successfully managed to survive through level 5. We've completed this level of the lair. Fortunately, haven't had to deal with anything too nasty. Hope you keep your wits about you as we delve deeper into the Lair of OmnusI. For tonight, you get 120 experience points and 50 feet of rope that I just happen to have. You can have it. Make sure you write all this on your character sheet. Until next time, I am OmnusI. Once again, wishing you safe adventures. Thank you for visiting here at the Lair of OmnusI. And again, please, if you enjoyed this episode, feel free to subscribe, like, or share with others. But more importantly to me, feel free to comment below. Let's get some conversation started. What do you do for horror? Or what of my rules may not make any sense? Do you want clarification? I certainly can oblige. But I thank you for watching.